Steve Harvey had hosted Family Feud for over 15 years, guiding thousands of families through moments of competition, celebration, and occasional tension on his stage. Throughout his extensive career in television, he had witnessed the complete spectrum of human behavior and family dynamics, from heartwarming demonstrations of support and encouragement to uncomfortable revelations of resentment and criticism that sometimes surfaced under the pressure of public performance. However, nothing in his considerable experience could have prepared him for what would unfold on that March afternoon in 2024, when a wife's public criticism of her husband would cross every line of acceptable conduct and trigger an immediate and powerful response from Steve that would halt the game completely and deliver one of the most direct confrontations about respect, support, and the fundamental obligations of partnership that had ever occurred on his stage. The Patterson family from Detroit, Michigan stood ready to compete against the Kim family from Los Angeles, California, both families having traveled to the studio excited about their opportunity to participate in America's most beloved game show. Yet beneath the surface of what should have been a fun family experience, a pattern of contempt and criticism was about to manifest in such a devastating way that it would stop production immediately and demonstrate that some behaviors are so damaging and disrespectful that they require immediate confrontation regardless of the setting in which they occur. If you value stories that remind us of the critical importance of supporting our partners rather than tearing them down, and the courage required to confront destructive patterns even when doing so is uncomfortable, please take a moment to engage with this content by hitting the like button and subscribing to our channel for more powerful narratives about families and the choices that either strengthen or destroy the relationships we claim to value. David and Jennifer Patterson had been married for 13 years, though the quality and character of those years had deteriorated significantly over the past 5 years in ways that would become tragically apparent through what was about to transpire on national television. David was 41 years old, a dedicated middle school science teacher whose passion for education had defined his professional life, even as the modest salary associated with teaching had created ongoing financial stress for his family. Jennifer, 39, worked as a pharmaceutical sales representative, a position that provided the majority of the family's income and that she frequently referenced when discussing household decisions and family dynamics. Her career success had become a source of pride for her, but also a weapon she wielded against David with increasing frequency and cruelty, as their marriage had evolved from partnership into something far more toxic and destructive. Their children completed the family lineup on the Family Feud stage. 11-year-old Brandon stood near his parents with the careful composure of a child who had learned to navigate complex and painful adult dynamics, his young face reflecting anxiety about being on television, but also about how his parents might interact in this public setting. 8-year-old Ashley displayed visible nervousness that seemed excessive for what should have been an exciting family adventure, her hand gripping her mother's with intensity that suggested she was seeking reassurance or perhaps trying to provide stability in a family system that felt increasingly unstable and unsafe. Jennifer's sister Karen, 35, rounded out the 5-person team, included in the Family Feud appearance at David's request as someone who might provide some buffer and support in what had become an increasingly difficult family dynamic. What made the Patterson family situation particularly troubling was not a single dramatic crisis, but rather a pattern of behavior from Jennifer that had systematically eroded David's sense of worth and value over the course of their marriage. When they had first married 13 years earlier, Jennifer had expressed admiration for David's commitment to education and his dedication to making a difference in the lives of young students navigating the challenges of middle school. However, as the financial realities of building a life on a teacher's salary became apparent, and particularly after Jennifer's own career success began generating substantially higher income than David's teaching position, her attitude toward his profession and his contributions to the family had shifted dramatically from support and appreciation to criticism and contempt. Jennifer had developed a pattern of making disparaging comments about David's career choice and his earning potential, suggesting that his decision to remain in teaching, despite the modest compensation, demonstrated lack of ambition or failure to prioritize his family's financial security and material comfort. She would compare him unfavorably to her colleagues and friends' husbands who worked in higher-paying professions, highlighting their career advancement and income growth in ways that made clear she viewed David as inadequate and disappointing in comparison. She would make comments about how much easier their lives would be if David had chosen a more lucrative career path, framing his dedication to teaching as a selfish indulgence that prioritized his own satisfaction over his family's needs and opportunities. These criticisms extended beyond career and financial matters into virtually every aspect of David's contributions to the family and household. Jennifer would criticize his parenting decisions and his interactions with their children, suggesting that he was too lenient or not sufficiently focused on achievement and success. She would dismiss his attempts to contribute to household management, finding fault with how he completed tasks, and suggesting that he was incompetent in basic domestic responsibilities. She would make cutting remarks about his appearance, his intelligence, his social skills, and his value as a partner, each comment delivered with casual cruelty that suggested she viewed him as fundamentally inadequate and failing to meet even basic standards of acceptability as a husband and father. David had attempted multiple times to address this pattern of criticism and contempt, expressing to Jennifer how her constant negativity affected his sense of self-worth and his experience of their marriage. He had suggested marriage counseling on numerous occasions, hoping that a professional third party might help Jennifer recognize how destructive her pattern of criticism had become, and how it was damaging both their relationship and their children's sense of family stability and safety. Jennifer had refused counseling each time, insisting that the problem was not her legitimate assessment of David's shortcomings, but rather his overly sensitive response to honest feedback and his failure to make necessary changes in his career and contributions that would address the valid concerns she was expressing. The reality, which David had begun to recognize with painful clarity, was that Jennifer's behavior constituted a form of emotional abuse that was systematically destroying his mental health and his ability to function effectively as a parent and professional. Her constant criticism and contempt communicated that he was worthless and inadequate, that nothing he did would ever be sufficient to earn her respect or appreciation, that his value as a human being was measured solely by his income generation, and that by that metric he was a profound disappointment and failure. David had begun experiencing symptoms of depression and anxiety that he recognized were directly connected to the toxic environment of his marriage, the constant barrage of criticism and dismissal that characterized his daily interactions with the person who was supposed to be his partner and supporter. David had reached a point where he was seriously questioning whether to remain in the marriage, recognizing that Jennifer's pattern of emotional abuse represented a fundamental character issue that was unlikely to change without professional intervention that she refused to pursue. He had consulted with a therapist individually to address his depression and anxiety, and to gain perspective on whether the treatment he was experiencing in his marriage was normal or acceptable. His therapist had been clear that Jennifer's behavior constituted emotional abuse, that no one deserved to be treated with the level of contempt and criticism that characterized Jennifer's interactions with him, and that he needed to make decisions about whether he could continue in the relationship given Jennifer's unwillingness to acknowledge the problem or seek help in changing her destructive patterns. The Family Feud appearance had been arranged through the school where David taught, part of a community outreach program that the show had established to highlight educators and their families. David had initially been excited about the opportunity, viewing it as a chance to create a positive family memory and perhaps to demonstrate to Jennifer and the children that he could succeed and excel in settings beyond his classroom. However, as the taping date approached, his excitement had been tempered by anxiety about how Jennifer might behave on camera and whether her pattern of criticism and contempt might manifest in this very public setting. His concerns proved to be entirely justified in ways that exceeded even his worst expectations about what might occur during the taping. The game began with standard Family Feud energy and production quality, Steve Harvey engaging both families with his characteristic warmth and humor. The Kim family presented as genuinely supportive and connected, their interactions with each other demonstrating authentic encouragement and celebration of each family member's contributions regardless of whether answers were correct or appeared on the board. The Patterson family's dynamics were noticeably different from the beginning, with Jennifer's body language and facial expressions communicating criticism and disapproval, even before any answers had been provided or any actual mistakes had been made. The first round proceeded with both families providing answers to the survey question with varying degrees of success. David was called upon to provide an answer early in the round, and he offered a response that seemed reasonable and well-considered based on the question being asked. However, his answer did not appear on the board, resulting in a strike for the Patterson family. This was a completely normal occurrence in Family Feud gameplay, as even the most thoughtful answers sometimes failed to match what survey respondents had provided, and typically such moments were met with good-natured acceptance and encouragement from family members supporting the contestant who had tried their best. Jennifer's response to David's incorrect answer was immediate and devastating in its cruelty and public nature. Before Steve Harvey could provide the usual encouragement or move on to the next family member, Jennifer turned to David with an expression of disgust and contempt that was visible to everyone in the studio. She spoke loudly enough that her words carried throughout the space, ensuring that the studio audience, the production crew, and the cameras all captured her assessment of her husband's performance and her opinion of his value and competence. Jennifer stated with unmistakable contempt that David's wrong answer was typical of everything he did, that he was a failure who could not succeed at anything he attempted, that she should have expected him to embarrass her and the family on national television just as he embarrassed her in every other aspect of their lives together. She continued by referencing his career as a teacher, suggesting that his inability to provide a correct answer on a game show was consistent with his inability to earn a decent living or contribute meaningfully to their family's success and security. Her words were delivered with such casual cruelty that it was clear this was not an isolated moment of frustration, but rather a reflection of deeply held contempt and a well-established pattern of verbal abuse that characterized their relationship. The studio audience gasped at Jennifer's words, the collective sound reflecting shock and dismay that someone would speak to their spouse with such devastating cruelty in any setting, much less on national television in front of their children and hundreds of witnesses. The Kim family stood at their podium looking profoundly uncomfortable, suddenly unwilling witnesses to a level of marital toxicity that went far beyond anything appropriate for a game show setting or any public forum. Brandon and Ashley stood frozen beside their mother, their young faces reflecting pain and embarrassment as they heard their father publicly humiliated by the person who was supposed to love and support him. Steve Harvey's reaction was immediate and visceral. His expression transformed from his usual game show host warmth to something that reflected profound offense and barely controlled anger at what he had just witnessed. He held up his hand to stop the game, his gesture commanding enough that the entire studio seemed to freeze in response to his obvious displeasure and the sudden shift in atmosphere from lighthearted competition to serious confrontation about fundamental human decency and respect. Steve turned to face Jennifer directly, and when he spoke, his voice carried none of its usual warmth or humor. Instead, it reflected controlled fury and absolute moral clarity about what he had just witnessed and what needed to be said in response. Steve told Jennifer in terms that were unmistakable and non-negotiable that what she had just said to her husband was one of the most cruel and unacceptable things he had ever heard a spouse say to their partner in his 15 years of hosting Family Feud, or in his entire life experience spanning nearly 7 decades. Steve articulated specifically what Jennifer had done wrong, ensuring there could be no confusion or attempt to minimize or reframe the situation. He described how she had publicly humiliated her husband for making a simple mistake on a game show question, how she had called him a failure in front of their children and hundreds of witnesses, how she had used his career as a teacher as a weapon to suggest he was inadequate and worthless because his profession did not generate high income. Steve made absolutely clear that this behavior was not acceptable or excusable under any circumstances, that it demonstrated profound disrespect for David as a human being and as the partner she had chosen to marry and build a life with. Jennifer attempted to respond with defensive justification, suggesting that Steve was overreacting to honest frustration about David's performance, and that her comments were simply truthful assessment of his limitations and failures rather than cruel or abusive statements. She attempted to frame her criticism as legitimate feedback that David needed to hear, suggesting that his sensitivity to her words reflected his own issues rather than any actual problem with how she communicated or what she chose to say about him publicly. This attempt to justify and minimize her behavior only intensified Steve's response, as he made clear that there was no context or justification that made calling your spouse a failure acceptable or appropriate. Steve's voice grew stronger and more passionate as he addressed not just what Jennifer had said, but the underlying attitudes and beliefs that had led to such devastating public humiliation of her partner. Steve told Jennifer that he needed her to understand something fundamental about marriage and partnership that she clearly had lost sight of or perhaps never understood. He explained that the person you marry becomes your partner and your teammate, that you take on an obligation to support and encourage that person rather than tear them down and destroy their sense of worth and value. He described how criticism and contempt were identified by relationship researchers as among the most destructive forces in marriage, that patterns of putting down your spouse would inevitably destroy the relationship and damage everyone involved, including children who witnessed such toxic dynamics. Steve turned his attention to David, and his expression and tone shifted immediately to reflect compassion and validation for a man who had just been publicly humiliated by the person who should have been his strongest supporter. Steve told David that he wanted him to hear something clearly, and that he wanted everyone in the studio and everyone watching at home to hear it as well. Steve stated unequivocally that David was not a failure, that choosing to dedicate your professional life to educating young people was one of the most valuable and important contributions anyone could make to society, that teachers deserved respect and appreciation rather than criticism and contempt for their commitment to shaping future generations. Steve spoke about the importance of teaching and the profound impact that dedicated educators had on students' lives and futures, sharing briefly about teachers who had influenced his own development and success. He made clear that measuring human worth solely through income generation was a fundamentally flawed and destructive approach to evaluating people, that there were countless forms of valuable contribution to society and family that had nothing to do with salary or financial status. He told David that his wife's assessment of him as a failure said nothing about David's actual worth or value, and everything about Jennifer's character and her failure to understand what truly mattered in life and relationships. Steve then returned his attention to Jennifer with even greater intensity, addressing not just what she had said, but what her words revealed about how she viewed her husband and their marriage. Steve told Jennifer that her contempt for David was destroying not just their marriage, but their children's sense of security and their understanding of what healthy relationships should look like. He described how Brandon and Ashley had just watched their mother call their father a failure on national television, how they would carry that moment with them, and how it would shape their understanding of marriage and partnership in ways that would affect their own future relationships. Steve challenged Jennifer directly about whether she understood the damage she was doing to her family through her pattern of criticism and contempt. He asked her whether she truly believed that David was worthless and inadequate, or whether she had simply fallen into a destructive pattern of communication that she had never examined or questioned. He told her that regardless of her answer, she needed to recognize that her behavior was unacceptable and damaging, that it constituted emotional abuse that was harming everyone in her family, and that she needed to make immediate changes in how she treated her husband or accept that she was actively destroying her marriage and traumatizing her children. Steve made clear that he was not going to continue with the game, while Jennifer maintained her stance that her criticism of David was justified or acceptable. He told her that she had a choice to make in this moment about whether she was willing to acknowledge the cruelty of what she had said and commit to treating her husband with basic respect and decency, or whether she would continue to defend her right to publicly humiliate and demean the father of her children, and the man she had promised to honor and cherish when they married 13 years earlier. The studio had fallen into complete silence during Steve's confrontation, every person present recognizing that they were witnessing something far beyond typical game show content or entertainment. Jennifer's face had shifted from defensive justification to visible discomfort as Steve's words penetrated her usual patterns of rationalization and denial about her treatment of David. Corinne, Jennifer's sister, stood with tears streaming down her face, apparently moved by Steve's defense of David and perhaps recognizing patterns in her sister's behavior that she had witnessed but never directly confronted. Jennifer attempted one more defensive response, suggesting that Steve did not understand their marriage or the legitimate reasons she had for frustration with David's choices and contributions. Steve cut off this attempt immediately, his voice carrying absolute finality as he stated that there was no legitimate reason for calling your spouse a failure on national television or in any other setting. That frustration about career or financial matters should be addressed through respectful private conversation rather than public humiliation and contempt. Steve told Jennifer that she needed to apologize to David immediately and genuinely, not with qualifications or justifications about why she felt entitled to say what she said, but with real acknowledgement that her words were cruel and wrong, and that David deserved better treatment from his partner and the mother of his children. He made clear that without such an apology, the taping would not continue, and the Patterson family would be asked to leave. Jennifer stood in silence for a long moment, clearly struggling between her habitual patterns of defending her right to criticize David and the dawning recognition that her behavior had been called out in the most public way possible, and that everyone present agreed with Steve's assessment rather than her own justifications. Finally, she turned to David with an expression that suggested genuine recognition of the damage she had caused, though whether this represented actual change or simply tactical response to public pressure remained unclear. Jennifer apologized to David for calling him a failure and for humiliating him in front of their children and the studio audience. Her apology was brief and lacked the depth of acknowledgement that Steve had called for, but it represented at least minimal recognition that her words had been inappropriate and hurtful. David accepted the apology with quiet dignity, though his face reflected the pain of years of similar treatment and uncertainty about whether this moment would lead to any genuine change in how Jennifer treated him moving forward. Steve then addressed both David and Jennifer together, making clear that what had occurred on the Family Feud stage was a symptom of deeper problems in their marriage that required professional intervention and genuine commitment to change. He connected them with information about marriage counseling resources, emphasizing that their pattern of interaction was destructive and unsustainable, and that without significant changes they were heading toward divorce and causing lasting damage to their children's emotional well-being and development. The game eventually resumed, though the atmosphere had shifted dramatically from lighthearted competition to something far more serious and emotionally charged. Both families completed the match with appropriate effort, though everyone present recognized that the real significance of the taping had nothing to do with game show scores and everything to do with the confrontation of toxic behavior and the powerful message Steve had delivered about respect, support, and the fundamental obligations of partnership in marriage. The Patterson family lost their match, though the outcome felt entirely secondary to the more important events that had transpired. When filming concluded, Steve spent considerable time with David and Jennifer separately, ensuring that David felt supported and validated after being publicly humiliated by his wife, and that Jennifer understood the seriousness of her behavior and the changes that needed to occur if their marriage was to survive and become healthy rather than continuing as a source of pain and damage for everyone involved. The episode aired with the confrontation included, as Steve and the production team determined that the message about respect and the dangers of contempt in marriage was too important to withhold from broadcast. The response from viewers was immediate and overwhelming, with millions expressing appreciation for Steve's willingness to stop the game and address Jennifer's cruelty rather than allowing it to pass without comment or consequence. Countless viewers shared their own experiences of being treated with contempt by spouses or of recognizing destructive patterns in their own behavior that needed to change. The immediate aftermath of the incident was difficult for the Patterson family. Jennifer was furious about being publicly called out and initially refused to acknowledge that her behavior required fundamental change rather than minor adjustments to avoid future public embarrassment. However, the overwhelming public response supporting Steve's confrontation and validating David's made it impossible for Jennifer to maintain her stance that she had done nothing wrong. David used the momentum from Steve's public defense to establish firmer boundaries in his marriage, insisting that Jennifer attend marriage counseling with him, or that they would need to separate, because he could no longer tolerate the level of criticism and contempt that had characterized their relationship. Faced with the potential dissolution of her marriage and the public judgment she had experienced following the episode's broadcast, Jennifer finally agreed to counseling. The therapeutic process was difficult and revealed the depth of Jennifer's issues with control, status anxiety, and her fundamental misunderstanding of what made relationships healthy and sustainable. She struggled to recognize how her behavior had constituted abuse rather than legitimate feedback, but gradually began to understand through professional guidance how her pattern of criticism had damaged David and their children. Progress was slow and marked by setbacks, but there was movement toward healthier patterns of interaction. 1 year after the Family Feud incident, the Patterson marriage remained intact, but fundamentally changed from what it had been. Jennifer had made genuine progress in recognizing and changing her patterns of criticism and contempt, learning to communicate frustrations without attacking David's worth or value as a person. David had rebuilt some of his self-esteem through individual therapy, and through the continued affirmation he received from students, colleagues, and community members who had seen the episode and reached out to express appreciation for his work as an educator. Harvey maintained periodic contact with the Patterson family, checking on their progress and offering continued encouragement and resources. He spoke about the incident in later interviews as an example of why toxic patterns in relationships needed immediate confrontation rather than polite silence, why defending people from abuse required courage even when doing so created discomfort or disruption, and why teachers and others in service professions deserved respect and appreciation for their contributions to society regardless of their income levels. If this story has reinforced your understanding that calling your spouse a failure is never acceptable, that contempt destroys marriages and damages children, and that we all have obligations to support rather than tear down the partners we claim to love, please take a moment to like this content and subscribe to our channel for more powerful narratives about families and the choices that either strengthen or destroy the relationships that shape our lives and the lives of our children.